January 1944, Central Italy. The morning air is already heavy with smoke. Artillery rounds fall somewhere beyond the hills, their echoes rolling through stone streets that were never built for war. Roof tiles lie shattered, windows are gone. Fire crawls along the upper floors of a large, aging building at the edge of town. Inside, children are crying, not from fear alone, but from the heat. This is not a military target. It never was. It is an orphanage, marked only by faded walls and a courtyard now filling with ash. German shells, aimed at Canadian forward positions nearby, have missed their mark. One round has ignited the building, another has collapsed part of the roof. A small group of Canadian soldiers shelters behind rubble less than 100 meters away. They are infantry, tired, dirty, already under orders to hold their ground. They can hear the bombardment adjusting. They can also hear the screams. For a moment, the war narrows to a single question, and the answer will pull them out of cover and into the fire. The reasons they are here and why this town became a battlefield at all begin days earlier. By the winter of 1943-1944, Canada's war was no longer distant. Canadian divisions were fully committed to the Italian campaign, a grinding advance up the spine of the peninsula that had begun with the landings in Sicily the previous summer. Italy was not collapsing as quickly as Allied planners had hoped. Instead, the German army had turned the country into a defensive maze, mountain ridges, rivers, and fortified towns transformed into killing zones. Central Italy mattered because it controlled the routes north. Every valley was a corridor, every town a potential strongpoint. The Germans understood this terrain intimately. They used elevation, stone construction, and prepared artillery positions to slow the Allied advance to a crawl. By January 1944, Canadian infantry units were operating alongside British formations, pressing against German defensive lines anchored south of Rome. The fighting was close and personal. Visibility was often poor. Artillery did much of the killing. Shelling was constant, sometimes accurate, sometimes indiscriminate. Civilian life had not vanished, it had simply been trapped. Towns that once served as market centers or religious hubs now sat directly between opposing gun lines. Evacuations were incomplete. Religious institutions, hospitals, and orphanages often remained occupied, their caretakers believing neutrality or markings might offer protection. In reality, shells did not discriminate. Buildings caught fire as easily as bunkers collapsed. Canadian units in this sector were assigned to hold forward positions near populated areas, a dangerous necessity driven by geography. Withdrawal would mean ceding ground. Advancing meant pushing through civilians who had nowhere else to go. In this environment, the distance between a military objective and a humanitarian crisis could be measured in seconds. And in one town, under rising smoke, that distance was shrinking fast. The Canadian soldiers positioned near the town were part of a frontline infantry formation tasked with maintaining pressure on German defenses just beyond the built-up area. Their role was limited and clear. Hold ground, observe enemy movement, and survive the shelling long enough for the next phase of the advance to be planned. There was no room in their orders for civilian rescue operations. The town itself had grown organically over centuries. Narrow streets, thick stone walls, and clustered buildings made it defensible and dangerously flammable. When artillery landed, fires spread vertically, jumping floors and beams faster than any bucket brigade could stop them. The orphanage sat near the outer edge of town, close enough to Canadian positions to be exposed to overshooting German fire. It housed dozens of children, most of them too young to understand why explosions had replaced church bells. The caretakers had stayed behind out of necessity. Transport was scarce, roads were cratered. Leaving would have meant walking through active shelling. German artillery observers operated from higher ground to the north. Their mission was simple: disrupt Canadian movement and pin infantry in place. Civilian buildings were collateral, not objectives. But once fires began, they created secondary dangers: smoke that blinded defenders, panic that drew people into the open, and chaos that could spread faster than shrapnel. For the Canadians nearby, the situation was clear and unforgiving. Moving toward the orphanage meant exposing themselves to observed artillery fire. Staying put meant listening as a non-military building burned with children inside. The war had created this moment without asking permission. What followed would not be recorded as a formal operation. There would be no map arrows or code names. But the decision that came next would reveal as much about the nature of the campaign as any planned assault. The Canadian soldiers positioned near the town were part of a frontline infantry formation tasked with maintaining pressure on German defenses just beyond the built-up area. Their role was limited and clear: hold ground, observe enemy movement, and survive the shelling long enough for the next phase of the advance to be planned. There was no room in their orders for civilian rescue operations. The town itself had grown organically over centuries. Narrow streets, thick stone walls, and clustered buildings made it defensible and dangerously flammable. When artillery landed, fires spread vertically, jumping floors and beams faster than any bucket brigade could stop them. The orphanage sat near the outer edge of town, close enough to Canadian positions to be exposed to overshooting German fire. It housed dozens of children, most of them too young to understand why explosions had replaced church bells. The caretakers had stayed behind out of necessity. Transport was scarce, roads were cratered. Leaving would have meant walking through active shelling. German artillery observers operated from higher ground to the north. Their mission was simple: disrupt Canadian movement and pin infantry in place. Civilian buildings were collateral, not objectives. But once fires began, they created secondary dangers: smoke that blinded defenders, panic that drew people into the open, and chaos that could spread faster than shrapnel. For the Canadians nearby, the situation was clear and unforgiving. Moving toward the orphanage meant exposing themselves to observed artillery fire. Staying put meant listening as a non-military building burned with children inside. The war had created this moment without asking permission. What followed would not be recorded as a formal operation. There would be no map arrows or code names. But the decision that came next would reveal as much about the nature of the campaign as any planned assault. The Canadian soldiers did not know the children personally. They did not know their names, their ages, or how many were still inside the orphanage. What they knew was sound: the sharp crack of burning timber, the coughing carried through smoke, and the unmistakable pitch of fear that cuts through artillery noise. Infantry training prepares men for violence, not for this. Under bombardment, the instinct is to stay low, minimize movement, and wait for the fire to lift. Breaking cover without orders risks death not only for the individual, but for those who might be forced to follow. Yet war does not erase moral awareness, it compresses it. Several soldiers moved first, not in a charge, but in short, deliberate runs between collapsed walls and shell craters. They were joined by others without discussion. There was no formal command issued. The urgency did not require one. Inside the orphanage, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Smoke filled hallways. Fire consumed upper floors. Caretakers attempted to move children toward exits that were already blocked by debris. Panic slowed everything. The Canadians entered through ground-level openings where walls had already been breached. They carried no firefighting equipment, only rifles slung aside, helmets pulled low, and the strength to lift, carry, and guide. Children were passed hand to hand. Some were carried, others were led, stumbling and half-blinded. Every trip out was a gamble. The shelling had not stopped, but each successful exit tightened the resolve to go back in. This was not heroism performed for recognition. It was action taken because delay meant loss. And while the human impulse drove them forward, the battlefield itself was tightening around them. The tactical and environmental angle. From a tactical standpoint, the rescue unfolded inside an active fire zone. German artillery was still ranging the area, and any visible movement risked drawing further fire. Smoke rising from the orphanage made the building more conspicuous, not less. What burned also marked a target. The Canadians had to move without forming patterns. Large groups would have been easier to spot, so they worked in small numbers, entering and exiting through different openings as the structure weakened. Rubble shifted underfoot. Flames moved unpredictably through old wooden beams hidden behind stone facades. Time was the most dangerous enemy. Prolonged exposure increased the risk of a direct hit. Yet speed alone could not solve the problem. Children had to be moved carefully, especially the youngest, whose lungs were already struggling against the smoke. The soldiers used nearby walls and depressions to shield evacuation routes. Children were taken to relative cover first, then moved farther back once numbers grew. No single area could safely hold them all. The rescue became a moving line of protection, constantly adjusting to the bombardment. German fire did not cease, but it did shift. Whether by chance or necessity, the shelling began to fall slightly farther south as the engagement continued. The window narrowed, then threatened to close entirely. Eventually, the fire reached structural limits. Portions of the roof collapsed inward, cutting off access to the upper floors. At that point, no further entry was possible without catastrophic risk. When the last accessible room was cleared, the soldiers withdrew. The orphanage was left burning, but empty. What had begun as a moral response under fire now reached its most dangerous moment. The bombardment was about to peak. As the last children were pulled clear of the orphanage walls, the bombardment intensified. The rhythm changed. Shells began to arrive closer together, walking their way across the town with deliberate spacing. German gunners were adjusting, searching for Canadian positions that had revealed themselves through movement. The soldiers could feel it in the ground before they heard it. Dust lifted from the rubble in small bursts, seconds before the concussions arrived. Stone fragments sliced the air. The fire inside the orphanage surged as oxygen rushed through newly collapsed sections of the roof. At this point, the rescue and the battle fully overlapped. Several Canadian soldiers remained exposed longer than planned, ensuring no one had been missed. Smoke reduced visibility to a few meters. Shouts were reduced to hand signals and touch. One misstep could mean falling debris, or worse, being caught in the open when the next round landed. The decision now was no longer whether to keep rescuing. It was when to stop. German artillery fire crept closer to the evacuation routes. The shelling pattern suggested observers were correcting for earlier overshoot. The window that had allowed the rescue was narrowing fast. When the final sweep of the lower floors confirmed no children remained, the withdrawal began under direct threat. The soldiers moved back in staggered bursts, covering each other, pulling the last civilians into shell-scarred basements and behind thick stone walls. Moments later, a direct hit struck the orphanage's upper structure. Flames erupted outward. The building began to collapse inward on itself. The timing was measured in seconds. What followed would determine whether the rescue ended in survival or tragedy. The shell that struck the orphanage landed where the roof had already been weakened by fire. Stone gave way. Timber beams snapped and folded inward. The sound cut through the bombardment like a final punctuation mark. By then, the children were no longer inside. Canadian soldiers and civilians pressed against cover as debris scattered across the street. Dust rolled through the air in thick waves, swallowing what remained of the building's outline. Where there had been walls and windows moments before, there was now only a burning shell. The artillery barrage continued for several more minutes, hammering the surrounding blocks. The soldiers stayed low, shielding the children as best they could. Helmets were placed over small heads. Bodies were angled toward the blasts. Training returned, not for attack, but for survival. When the shelling finally lifted, the silence felt unnatural. Smoke drifted slowly upward. The orphanage was gone. What remained were children sitting in doorways, wrapped in blankets and greatcoats far too large for them. Some cried, others were silent, exhausted beyond fear. Caretakers moved among them, counting, recounting, unable to believe the numbers were intact. The Canadians did not linger. Their positions still had to be held. The war had not paused because of what they had done. As orders resumed and weapons were taken up again, the rescue slipped almost immediately into the background of the larger fight. No formal report captured every movement. No camera recorded the smoke-filled corridors. But the consequences of those minutes would carry forward, quietly, unmistakably, into what came next. When the area stabilized later that day, the scale of destruction became clearer. The orphanage had been completely destroyed. What stood before the bombardment was now a collapsed mass of stone, charred beams, and ash. There were no usable rooms left, no roof to salvage, and no possibility of immediate reconstruction. What mattered was what was not found in the debris. All of the children who had been inside were alive. Medical orderlies examined them as conditions allowed. Most suffered from smoke inhalation, shock, and minor injuries caused by falling debris during the evacuation. None had been trapped during the final collapse. The caretakers, many of whom had remained inside until the last possible moment, were treated alongside them. For the Canadian unit involved, the rescue was not logged as a separate action. It appeared only indirectly in operational notes and post-action reports that referenced civilian evacuation under fire. The priority of documentation remained enemy positions, ammunition expenditure, and casualties. There were no medals issued on the spot. No formal citations followed immediately. The war in Italy did not allow for pauses. Within hours, the unit was again engaged in holding ground under renewed pressure. The orphanage site was marked temporarily to prevent further civilian movement into the ruins. The children were relocated to safer structures farther from the line. What had happened was real, undeniable, and already receding into the relentless momentum of the campaign. Yet its impact did not end there. In the days that followed, word of the rescue circulated quietly through the local population. It was not broadcast, but remembered. In a landscape where destruction had become routine, restraint and intervention stood out sharply. For the civilians who witnessed it, The distinction between occupier, liberator, and bystander became suddenly clearer. For the Canadian soldiers, the event was rarely discussed in detail. Wartime memory often compresses moments of intense moral clarity into brief recollections, especially when survival demands focus elsewhere. Many of the men involved moved on with their units as the campaign pushed northward, crossing rivers and towns that would blur together over time. Official Canadian records of the Italian campaign contain references to civilian assistance under fire, but seldom dwell on individual acts. The emphasis remained operational. Yet post-war accounts, local testimonies, and regimental histories preserved fragments, mentions of an orphanage, a fire, children carried through smoke. The orphanage itself was never rebuilt in its original form. The children it sheltered grew up displaced by war, their lives redirected by forces far beyond that single day. Some would later recall the moment not as a battle, but as hands reaching through smoke, lifting them into light. The Canadian unit involved continued to serve through the remainder of the Italian campaign, enduring casualties and exhaustion as the war dragged on. The rescue did not change the course of the war, but it changed outcomes that mattered deeply, precisely because they were small. What remains is not a tactical victory, but a human one. War is often measured in ground gained or lost, in lines on maps, in numbers tallied after the guns fall silent. But beneath those calculations lie moments that never appear in operational summaries, moments where the purpose of fighting is tested against its cost. The rescue of the orphanage did not alter the Italian campaign. It did not delay the German retreat or accelerate the Allied advance. Yet it stands as a reminder that even inside industrial warfare, choice still exists. The Canadian soldiers involved were not ordered to act. They were trained to survive, to hold ground, to return fire. What they did instead was recognize life where the war saw only terrain. This is not a story of defiance or spectacle. It is a story of restraint, timing, and proximity, of men close enough to hear fear and willing to step toward it while shells were still falling. Their actions carried risk without reward, urgency without recognition. For the children who survived, the war would continue to shape their lives in ways no one could control. But on that day, under bombardment, the trajectory changed. Survival replaced absence. Memory replaced loss. History often remembers wars through their destruction. This moment endures because it resisted it. And in doing so, it reveals something quieter, but no less enduring, about the nature of humanity under fire.